Thank you to all the people who worked hard to make this event possible, the Italian Academy, the Maison Française, and obviously thank you to Carlo Ginzburg for being here, for all his work, for inspiring generations and generations of historians. I have lots of questions, but I will start with a question about making, or the becoming Carlo Ginzburg. And here I'm paraphrasing the title of a chapter in your book on Machiavelli and Pascal. And this chapter called Becoming Machiavelli. And in that chapter, you have a very interesting analysis of a pivotal text in Machiavelli's trajectory, a 1506 letter, in which basically you see the transformation from a conception of politics from doing into making, and you analyze this in the light of Machiavelli's library as a young man. The books he's read, the book that his father bought and had in his library, Plutarch's Lives, Aristotle's Politics, Aquinas' commentaries on Aristotle politics. So I have a question about your library, the library that you grew up with, the books you've read as a young man. Somewhere, I forgot where actually, I could not find it for today, but somewhere you wrote that in the 1950s, you were reading mostly fictions. And so I have a question about the role of fiction. Which novels were you reading? And what you think about the role of fiction in the training of historians? And obviously I'm asking this question in the light of the fact that your mom was a very important writer, Natalia Ginzburg. She's written she's written many books, but maybe the one that is most famous in the United States is Family Lexicon, was published originally in 1963. And that's a book in which she thinks a lot about language. She describes the life of a middle class, very educated but middle class family in Italy in the first half of the 20th century. She describes many different things, but she speaks about fascism and how fascism shapes the life of people, and she describes it through their eyes and through their words. So I'm interested in this idea of a family lexicon. I'm interested in your reflection on language and on how language shapes worldviews, how language shapes the way in which people can agree or disagree on things, how they can understand the world and what happens to them. And I was wondering if that family lexicon has been important to the becoming Carlo Ginzburg.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's such a privilege to be here, and I'm so grateful to David, Shani, and Peter for their introductions. My answer to your question will be probably surprising. First of all, I will start with my father, Leone Ginzburg. He was born in Odessa in a secular Jewish family. In 1917, they moved to Berlin, then to Italy. My father's mother and his siblings were in Torino, and my father studied at the University of Turin. His dissertation was on Guy de Maupassant, and then he started to write on Russian literature, and he taught Russian literature, but his academic career stopped when he refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the fascist regime. And he co-founded the Einaudi publishing house. He was a close friend of Giulio Einaudi. And in 1934, he was put on trial for his underground anti-fascist activity. And he spent 2 years in jail. And when the war, Italy entered the war, my father, who had lost his Italian citizenship, being Jewish after the racist 1938 laws, my father was sent to in internal exile to a village near L'Aquila. And I grew up in Pizzoli, that village. Now, at the age of 4, I was, let's say, confronted with an extraordinary book for children written by Luigi Capuana, a naturalist, a late 19th century writer. And in that book, there is a chapter on Il Lupo Mannaro, the werewolf. And I still remember, here I would like to stress that my experience concerning that book can be dated very clearly, because when the fascist regime collapsed, my father went to Rome. When the German troops entered in Pizzoli, my mother and the children reached my father. So, I mean, there are, let's say, dates related to big historical events. And so I can date my experience, and I'm surprised by the fact that actually my vivid memory of my reaction to Capuana's book are in fact related to a child who was 4 at that time. So the werewolf story, it's about the story of a little girl, and the little girl enter in an apartment. The apartment is empty, and then a little human being enters the room, and he has a turban with a huge with a huge feather on top, and then there was an illustration, and I remember the illustration. And then the next page, there is a wolf attacking the girl. And I remember that I was, let's say, going back and forth between the 2 pages, and I was much more scared by the little human being than by the wolf. Now, yeah, the name of the human being was Gomitetto. Now, why I'm mentioning this? Because much later, during my research trajectory, I started to work on werewolves in the night battles, in Storia Notturna, and more recently in the book which I wrote with Bruce Lincoln on a very anomalous werewolf. Now, one could say, okay, this was just a coincidence. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure. Why? Because as my mother told in a beautiful text, Inverno in Abruzzo, her children were, let's say, there was a young peasant girl who was taking care of them. Her name was Crocetta. And Crocetta was singing songs with macabre overtones. And now, I think that I was exposed to this peasant culture embodied by Crocetta. And what was remarkable is that 50 years later, since my wife is from Abruzzi, I was able to meet Crocetta, and there was this moving encounter with her. Okay, so there was a filter, and the filter was, let's say, a human being, a filter between, let's say, I would say, between myself and Capuana. Okay, in that case, there is a book, in my reaction to the book. 1 year later, I was 5, I was in Tuscany with my mother and my maternal grandmother, and my father died in Rome after having been tortured by the Nazis, and but I didn't know that. And we were on the front line, and I remember the German officers in the place where we were staying. And I have a vivid memory of, let's say, my maternal grandmother, the only non-Jewish member of my family, saying to me, if somebody is going to ask you, what's your name? You should say, my name is Carlo Tanzi. I didn't know that, let's say, Tanzi was a, let's say, name, and Carlo was the name of a father. I mean, Tanzi was the family name. But I remember my grandmother writing the word Carlo Tanzi on a copy of a book, which I was listening to from my grandmother and my mother. And the title of the book by Carola Prosperi was Il più felice bambino del mondo, the happiest child in the world. Now, retrospectively, I understood that at that moment, I became Jewish. So even in that case, I mean, that crucial turning point was in a way related to a book. Let's make a little shift in time. I was in Turin. I was probably 10, 11 or so, and I read War and Peace. I mean, this seems absurd. Obviously, I mean, I was unable to understand, a book like this, but I was deeply impressed also because the introduction to that book was signed by an asterisk. And this was, in fact, a signature imposed to my father as a Jew, because I remembered that when we were in Pizzoli, when he had been sent in internal exile, he was revising a previous translation of War and Peace, the translation I was reading. Now, I reread War and Peace in translation. Unfortunately, I have no Russian, but I reread War and Peace several times, and in an essay entitled Microhistory, 2 or 3 Things I Know About It, I explained in which sense War and Peace had such an impact on me, and in which sense my, let's say, trajectory towards microhistory was under the impact of novels, but starting from War and Peace, but including also novels completely different, including not only, let's say, Dostoevsky, but for instance, Kafka's Metamorphoses. I have a vivid memory of my mother walking with me and saying, yeah, it's a story, there is a story about a man who is turned into an insect. Unforgettable. Now, retrospectively, I said that novels are a nourishment for imagination, moral imagination. So we can identify ourselves with a murderer like Raskolnikov, with an insect, and so on and so forth. And this is the reason why, when many years ago, my friend Adriano Sofri, in a long conversation we had on a train, and he published the outcome of that conversation as an interview, he asked me, which is your advice for young historians? And I said, reading many novels. And why? Well, because they nourish imagination, moral imagination. They counteract the impulse to our provincialism. Now,
thank you. Can I? I'm sorry.
No, I should. I mean, I can go on, but I mean that would be too much.
I actually have a specific question. I mean, kind of follow-up question about that. You just said that you have no Russian, but you have so many other languages, right? You work with a lot of different languages, both classical and modern languages. And I want you to tell us a little more about this, about the importance of immersing oneself in languages, when different languages. Your work is very much that of a philologist, right? You trace the history of words through text in both very short and long durée. It's also the work of a translator. When we read your book, they are actually long translations, right? Like you have the original text and your translation, because some translations might exist, but it's not exactly what you want us to read from the text. So I want you to tell us a little more about this, about translations and how those, and philology, and how those practices are maybe important to what you've called slow reading and reading of text, and to the historical craft.
Well, once again, my father was a philologist. He edited Leopardi's Canti in a prestigious series inspired by Benedetto Croce, published by La Terza. And actually, he also worked with Santoro de Benedetti at the edition of autographs of Ariosto. And in fact, my father said in one occasion that Santoro de Benedetti was il suo maestro, not Croce. I was surprised by this because the relationship between my father and Croce was very deep, but Santoro de Benedetti was his maestro. So, I mean, I think that, let's say, I'm not a philologist, but I'm certainly fascinated by philology. And so I was delighted when I came across the definition of philology given by Friedrich Nietzsche, a philologist before becoming a philosopher, the art of slow reading. And as I argued many times since many years, I think that it's possible and truthful to combine the speed of internet and slow reading. So a sophisticated use of internet can lead to slow reading, to a slow reading of books. My experience of slow reading is in my recollection connected to my first year at the Scuola Normale in Pisa, when Delio Cantimori, the great historian, came from Florence and started a seminar. And we were sitting around a table, and he said, I mean, the topic of the seminar was Burckhardt weltgeschichtliche Betrachtungen. And he said, there are people here who knows German, and somebody said yes. And he said, well, we are going to compare, let's say, the original text by Burckhardt and different translations. And so we started that seminar, which lasted 1 week. We met, let's say, for I think 3 or 4 hours every morning. At the end of that week, we had read 20 lines. I was speechless, fantastic, something which I would have never imagined. Now, what is so fascinating in, let's say, translations is the fact, I think, that they are not and are never an equivalent. Even, let's say, soleil and sun are not equivalent. First of all, from, let's say, the point of view of sound and associations related to sound and so on. But, and then there are, let's say, something which is much more complicated. I must say, there is this, that 1,000 book edited by Barbara Cassin, Le Dictionnaire des Intraduisibles. Now, I mean, it's a dictionary. There are entries which are really remarkable. Other entries are less so. I was, let's say, fascinated by the project, less so by the way in which retrospectively Barbara Cassin interpreted her own project, which seemed to me more conventional. But the idea of intraduisible, this is fascinating. Mind, Geist, Esprit, fantastic. Because obviously, I mean, those 3 words are translatable. They are not identical. They suggest different associations, different intellectual trajectories, and so on and so forth. So I think that, let's say, translatability is a fascinating topic.
Thank you. I have a question that, in a way, is about translation, but maybe between cultures rather than languages per se. So, in a way, I want to go back to this to your pivotal text, or to the pivotal text in your pivotal central texts, or things that where your thought moved. And that's obviously the Cheese and the Worms, published in 1976, a book that is now considered as one of the models, one of the most exemplary models of microhistory, even though at the time the concept didn't exist, right? The word and the concept of microhistory didn't exist. And I don't think I don't have the time to summarize the book, but it's really a book about culture, right? About what makes culture, how does it change in general, and also it's about a reflection about the how kind of dialogue, the kind of exchanges between high and low culture. And you make a point in this book that cultural change doesn't go only from high to low, right? But it's a much more complex set of influences. And there was a moment in the 1970s where culture was central to the work of historians. It's much less the case today. Today, the pendulum, right, has shifted in a completely different direction. You have a global history that is not very interested in micro phenomena, but also not very interested in culture. I would even say that historians today are afraid of the concept of culture, right? Either they think that they're afraid of being labeled culturalists, that is to say, of taking culture too seriously, while they want to see inventions, right? So they're kind of uncomfortable with that concept, or, and in a way it's in tension with the first position, they see culture as incommensurable, as unable to speak to each other. So I want to have your thought on what we do with culture today in the kind of 1970s anthropological sense of culture. And I'm asking this question maybe with a slight dose of irreverence, because your work has shifted, it seems, from the idea of culture in that anthropological sense. A lot of the work you've done in the past 30 years have been very much about kind of intellectual history related to text, and apparently, less about popular culture or the relationship between popular culture and, let's say, elite culture. So I wanted to ask you about this, about when you write about Machiavelli or Pascal or all those texts, is this for you cultural history? Do you see these texts as shaping, right, as being shaped and shaping a larger culture? Or is this more, are you more interested in the relationship between one text to the other as read by, let's say, a smaller part of the population?
Thank you. Very challenging question. Now, I'm not convinced by what you said about culture today in historical studies. I think that, let's say, culture is still a concern for, a lot of historians. And in fact, I wrote an essay which is called Microhistory and World History, in which I used it's an essay which has two sections. First of all, I reflected on the genealogy of a notion, the notion of mental experiments, which seemed to me very important. And so I reconstructed a trajectory from Hobbes to Vico. Now, Vico read Hobbes in Latin, and this is important because the name of Hobbes was absent in Croce's essay on Vico. But Vico's Latin translation of himself, of the English version of Leviathan, has some passages, as I proved, I think, that were very important for Vico. So the notion of mental experiment for Hobbes, Vico, and then there is a long footnote in Marx' Capital, in which actually Marx comments on Vico and the notion of experiment, and then Labriola, splendid remarks by Labriola, which were translated into French and read by Trotsky when he was in jail in Odessa, and then Croce, Gentile, Collingwood. Now, this trajectory seems to me very important, because in my view, historians in their own work are, let's say, necessarily, they have to use mental experiments. For instance, saying, okay, this word means no. And then, so there are, let's say, bifurcations. And actually what I would like to add is that even in everyday life, we are making mental experiments when we are, let's say, reacting to other people's, let's say, comments or, let's say, facial expressions and so on and so forth, trying to interpret their reactions. I'm very fond of this contiguity between, let's say, the technical work of historians and the everyday life experience. In any case, I insisted on this because I insisted on the artificial element in microhistory, which is related to, let's say, the role played by mental experiments. And actually, I quoted a comment made by Franco Venturi, the great historian, who said dismissively to Giovanni Levi, I like history without additivi. So micro was a sort of additivo, yeah. On the contrary, I said that the artificial element in microhistory seems to me very important. And then I worked on a case. And the case was, let's say, a book published in Brussels with a sort of anonymous, an anonymous author, Lac, and 3 asterisks. A comparison between Indian rites and rites in Judaism. And so I tried to show how a case like that could prove, well, could show the connection, the possible connection between, let's say, a single case and a much larger perspective, macro-historical perspective. Now, in fact, I insisted on the mental experiments because for the first time in my life, and maybe the last one, I disagreed with Marc Bloch, because Bloch, in his The Historian's Craft, insisted on the opposition between hard sciences and sciences humaines. Experiments are not, let's say, possible and available to human sciences. Yeah, but if we take not experiments, but mental experiments, the argument doesn't work. And I think this is very important. In any case, so the possibility of using the study of a case in order to establish a connection between micro and macro, well, it's part of my trajectory towards microhistory, which is based on cases. Now, you said something very interesting about, let's say, my shift from, let's say, culture in an anthropological sense and, let's say, culture in the sense of the intellectual history. Now, I must say that for me, what I learned from Menocchio and the way in which he read his books is something which was very helpful in order to understand how Dante, Machiavelli, Pascal read their books. How? Well, because the notion of a filter, different filters, of course, something which I learned from Menocchio and something which I learned behind, let's say, my work on Menocchio from Ernst Gombrich's book Art and Illusion. So you may see how, let's say, a visual filter can be translated into a textual filter, oral filter as well. Now, the importance of this filter in the interaction between a reader and a book is something which I try to rework with, let's say, authors completely different from Menocchio, from the other writers like Dante, Machiavelli, Pascal, and so forth. So for me, this distinction between, let's say, the experience, the notion of culture in an anthropological sense, and the so-called culture as culture of the elite doesn't work. Doesn't work because we may use, well, I wouldn't say the same instruments, but certainly I would say there is a dialogue between the so-called two contexts or two dimensions.
Thank you. Another way of thinking about this is about the moment when there is actually, when the filters become an obstacle, when it becomes a barrier, right? When I'm thinking, for example, about some kind of comparison we can make between the way you think about subaltern cultures in The Cheese and the Worms and the way that, let's say, the Subaltern Studies collective led by Ranajit Guha and Indian historians think about subalternity. By this I mean that in The Cheese and the Worms, you actually do quote, you use the concept of subaltern, right? And for you it means both a situation of domination, but also the ability that Menocchio has to reflect on domination and to contest it, right, very strongly. And the idea also that there are actually indeed a lot of exchanges and dialogues, conflicts, but also exchanges between different spheres of culture. And at the same time, when you publish this, a few years later, Ranajit Guha publishes a book about peasant insurgencies, right, in India, where he really thinks about subalternity as, he calls this an autonomous political domain, right? The subaltern, even in a condition of, in a situation of incredible domination, such as the British colonization of India, can keep a form of political and cultural autonomy. They have their own categories, they think. Specifically, they are autonomous. And so, is there any possibility of dialogue between these different ways of thinking of subalternity? And I'm saying this because there is one article that I found very interesting when I read it years ago, on called "The Voice of the Others," and it's about the Mariana Islands natives and how they are, or their voices was actually quote unquote recorded by the Jesuits, but completely reframed and imagined, right? It's a work of imagination by the Jesuits. Maybe I misread it, but with like an imposition of a very classical kind of form, which is a harangue, which you find again in Diderot's beautiful Supplément au voyage de Bougainville. And in that text, I mean, it seemed that because of the work, the stylistic work, the rhetorical work of the Jesuits, the voice of the alien is completely silenced, right? Menocchio could speak. You could hear Menocchio. You could not hear all the people who had some kind of, weird cosmogonies at the time, but you could hear the voice of Menocchio. That subaltern could speak. So my question is, what do you do with that? I mean, we're at Columbia, so question is, can the subaltern speak? Who are the subalterns that can speak to us? Are there limits to that? I mean, are filters always filters, or are there ways of recuperating something like, or are there ways in which actually it becomes, to some extent, impossible?
Thank you. Well, let me start with a little anecdote. In 1988, I went for the first time to India. There was a conference organized by Jacques Le Goff, and so a group of European historians, actually all of them being French, except Peter Burke and myself. And so they asked me, Maurice Aymar asked me, would you like to go first by yourself to India or later? And I said, no, I would like to go first. And then I went to Delhi and gave a lecture at the Nehru University. I don't remember the topic of my lecture, but what I remember is, let's say, the extremely lively interaction with the audience. And I was struck by the fact that actually there was a sort of common language. And I thought, well, this is Marxism. And then I thought, no, there is something more specific. This is Gramsci. And then I went to Calcutta, where the conference was going to take place. And very, how can I say, let's say, an Indian historian with an Oxonian accent asked me, well, you are Italian, so what's the real meaning of subalterno? And then I tried to answer, saying, well, there are military overtones and so on and so forth. Only years later, I realized that, in fact, Gramsci, in order to circumvent fascist censorship in his jail, took a distance from the Comintern language. And this was something crucial as far as the posthumous impact of Gramsci's thought is concerned. As far as I know, nobody remarked this. I commented this in an essay on Ernesto De Martino, but this seems to me something very important. If we think about, let's say, notions like subalterno, hegemonia, and filosofia della prassi. Now, filosofia della prassi had been used by Gentile, but I would say that if Gramsci would have used the word proletarians instead of classi subalterne, its impact in India and in other countries as well would have been zero. So now that work you mentioned, Histoire des îles Mariannes, written by a Jesuit, Charles Gobien, I came across this book by chance. I am fascinated since a long time by the identity in Italian between chance and case, both of them being, let's say, used by caso. And so I was working in Florence at the Biblioteca Riccardiana, and I asked for a book. I don't remember which one, but the book was bound, literally bound, with another book. This was the embodiment of Aby Warburg's famous motto about, let's say, the good neighbor. The book you need is the book close to the one you are looking for. And so there was this book, which was completely unexpected, and this was Charles Gobien, a name completely unknown to me, Histoire des îles Mariannes, and I started to go through it, and I came across a speech delivered by the leader of a revolt, of an indigenous revolt. And I was really struck. And then many years later, I started to work on this text. And I remember that my text was still unpublished, and I gave a lecture on it in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And when I spoke about this speech, which is a aggressive denunciation of, let's say, European colonization, somebody came from the audience and said, magnificent. So something which was still very alive. And actually, I have been working on this text, starting from the hypothesis that everything was fictitious, and actually a reworking of a text by Tacitus in Agricola, denouncing the Roman Empire. But then there is a detail, and the detail is a footnote in which Le Gobien says, but this person, Urao, the leader of the revolt, says that Europeans brought insects and illnesses to these islands. But this is grotesque, it's absurd. So, I mean, the detail seemed to me very interesting because and at that point I advanced a general remark which was maybe too bold, but the fact that it's impossible for somebody who writes a text to control everything in the text. So the question about can the subaltern speak seems to me ridiculous.
Thank you. I had a lot of other questions, but I will, I think, summarize all my questions into one so that we can open to the Q&A. One could say that a lot of your work in the past 30 or 40 years has been about not the history of truth, à la Foucault, right? But has been about the history of the procedures in which truth can be established and communicated. And you've taken very strong positions against what you've called neo-skepticism, in both historical writing and in the humanities in general. And you have warned historians, you have wonderful pages that, about the difference between, let's say, contextual truths and plausible truths in some of your work, or between absolute and conditional truth. You've in the book on Machiavelli and Pascal, you have wonderful pages about perspective as an interesting concept for historians to think about when they want to maybe avoid the pitfalls of radical relativism. Your work has been really about the reaffirmation of knowledge, of the possibility of knowledge beyond and even through the filter of language and representations. And so I understand that it is a little late, but could you, it would be interesting for our audience, for you to maybe say why this has been so important for you, and how you have led this, this agenda, how you have proceeded to think about the possibility of, historical knowledge. I'm going to add one little thing here as a coda, again, and I'm going to stop asking you questions. But obviously, to go to the present, truth seems to be elusive to us, and fragile, and unstable in our present, in our political present. So I wanted to ask you about the role of historians and of the historians' work to help us think about truth today, and not so much about establishing and communicating truth, but also about ways in which we can still desire truth, yearn for truth.
Thank you. Well, I remember that many years ago I was at Yale, and there was a conference. At a certain moment I was speaking, and I said, truth without quotation marks, as people say, and in the academia, and the audience started to laugh. I wonder whether they would laugh today. I think that, let's say, neo-skepticism played a role in weakening the resistance to fake news. And we have to fight against fake news. As I said some time ago, I was invited by a Chilean historian to participate in a conference on post-verdad, and I immediately accepted, because that notion is something which I regarded as dangerous, and so I wanted to fight against it. And my contribution to that conference was post-verdad as an old new story. Now, old insofar as, let's say, the idea of, let's say, using lies in order to manipulate masses. It's an old story. But certainly, technologies change, and the new technology is certainly much more dangerous. But we have to fight against it. And I'd been, many years ago, I discovered that I'd been recruited in, let's say, among the postmodernist historians. And I was, let's say, not particularly flattered. And so and when I started to teach at UCLA, I was shocked by the fact that the most brilliant students were fascinated by neo-skepticism. Then there was an event. Hayden White came on campus. He delivered a speech showing his arguments and so on. And I was in the audience, and I commented in, let's say, harsh, polite terms. And so there was a real debate. And my friend Shaul Friedlander, who was in the audience, and he was teaching at UCLA as well as I was, and he said, well, I mean, we met, we had dinner and together, and Shaul said, we have to organize a conference in order to debate with this kind of perspective in the approach to the Shoah, which is what happened. And then there was a confrontation between Hayden White and myself. And actually, I mean, there are probably one or more, even possibly two books on this debate. The echoes on this debate are still going on. Hayden White is not here to, let's say, contradict me, but I was really shocked when I discovered on Google that he had said in an interview to the Italian newspaper Il Manifesto, when somebody said, what do you think about Carlo Ginzburg's attitude and so on? And he said, well, he has a biblical notion of truth. But he said, his book, The Cheese and the Worms, is in fact a work of fiction. There are just a few sentences, and he has expanded them in a fiction. Now, this is a lie, because I mean, the publication of the proceedings of the trials against Menocchio amount to more than 200 pages. So, I mean, I say the lie, but one could say, well, this is simply a, let's say, lack of concern for factual truth. I think that, let's say, this is still a crucial problem. And we have to, as I said, to fight against it. But how? Well, many years ago, I was invited to give some lectures in Jerusalem. And I suddenly realized that the argument, which has been used by Hayden White and other historians, concerning the alleged contiguity or lack of rigorous boundaries between history and fiction, was in fact based on rhetoric. Everything is rhetoric. But I realized something which was la lettre volée, the purloined letter of Edgar Allan Poe, meaning that there are two traditions about rhetoric. Aristotle's tradition, according to which proofs play a big role in his definition of rhetoric, and Aristotle, read and reworked by Quintilian, and Quintilian read and reworked by Lorenzo Valla, are a crucial element of historical reflection and work today. If we ignore the way in which Lorenzo Valla demonstrated that the alleged donation of Constantine was a forgery, we are lost. We are lost, and we will be unable to prove that the alleged diaries of Hitler were in fact a forgeries. So we have to insist on this tradition. And against another tradition of rhetoric, which was in fact put forward in a brilliant essay, Inacceptable, but brilliant, but inacceptable, by Nietzsche, which was, published posthumously on Truth and Lie. And this Nietzsche's argument had been, let's say, echoed by Nietzsche's epigons and so on. And that argument is explicitly anti-Aristotelian. It's an argument against proofs. Actually, I put as a title of my lectures in Jerusalem, History, Rhetoric, and Proof. And the idea of putting proof in the title was not obvious. In fact, I was thinking about, let's say, comparison made by Gramsci, but in a completely different context. I mean, when he compared and opposed guerra di posizione, trenches, and guerra di movimento. Thinking about, let's say, the possibility of a revolution in Western Europe. And I thought, well, I mean, which would be the sort of reworking and translation of this opposition as far as the debate against and with and against neo-skeptics. And I thought, well, guerra di posizione, trenches, this would be fictional narratives are fictional narratives, historical narratives are historical narratives, and so on and so forth. But guerra di movimento means invading the enemy's position and field, and to use rhetoric against their use of rhetoric.
Thank you. I think it's a good time to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.